The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the third time. At 28, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, and the routine had become second nature. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward, ignore the tourists and their endless photographs. Nothing ever happened during the day shift that couldn't be handled with military precision and protocol. Thomas had grown up in a small village outside Manchester, where his father worked in the local factory and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. Joining the Queen's Guard had been his ticket to a different life, one filled with honor and tradition. He took pride in the iconic red uniform, the towering bearskin hat, and the responsibility of protecting the monarch. Every morning, he reminded himself that he was part of something bigger than himself. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the stoic guards who never moved, never smiled, never acknowledged their presence. Thomas had mastered the art of looking through people rather than at them. Children would wave frantically, trying to get a reaction. Adults would pose beside him, making faces or gestures, hoping for a story to tell back home. He had seen it all and remained unmoved, but today felt different somehow. There was an unusual tension in the air, though Thomas couldn't pinpoint why. The other guards seemed restless during the morning briefing. Intelligence reports had mentioned increased security concerns, but nothing specific. Just the usual reminders, to stay alert and report anything unusual through proper channels. As the crowd began to thicken around midday, Thomas noticed a small girl among the tourists. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and clothes that looked like she had been wearing them for days. Unlike the other children who pressed close to the barriers with their parents, this girl stood alone, several feet back from the crowd. Her eyes weren't filled with the typical wonder and excitement that children usually showed when seeing the guards. Instead, she looked frightened. The girl kept glancing around nervously as if searching for someone or something. Thomas noticed. She was clutching a small piece of paper in her dirty hands, folding and unfolding it repeatedly. Her behavior was odd enough to catch his attention, but protocol demanded he maintain his position and composure. Guards were not permitted to interact with civilians during duty hours, except in cases of immediate security threats. For the next hour, the girl remained in roughly the same spot, moving only slightly within a small area. She would approach the crowd hesitantly, then retreat again. Thomas began to worry. Where were her parents? Why was she alone? The protective instincts that had made him a good soldier were beginning to override his training to remain detached and focused solely on his duties. During a brief moment when the tourist crowd thinned, the girl suddenly ran forward toward the gate where Thomas stood guard. She looked directly at him with desperate eyes and held up the crumpled piece of paper. On it, written in shaky letters with what appeared to be a crayon, were 3 simple letters that made Thomas's blood run cold. SOS. The little girl pressed the paper against the iron bars of the gate, her small fingers barely able to reach through. She didn't speak, but her eyes communicated everything. This wasn't a game or a tourist's attempt at interaction. This was a genuine cry for help from a child in distress. Thomas felt his heart racing beneath his perfectly pressed uniform, but he forced himself to remain motionless, his training warring with his human instincts. In that moment, Thomas realized that everything he thought he knew about his duty was about to change. The rules and protocols that had governed his every move for 6 years suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the terror he saw in this little girl's eyes. She needed help, and somehow she had identified him as someone who might be able to provide it. Thomas stared at the SOS message for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. His mind raced through the protocols he had memorized during training. Any suspicious activity was to be reported to the duty officer immediately. Any interaction with civilians required approval from a superior. Breaking character while on guard duty was strictly forbidden and could result in disciplinary action or dismissal from the regiment. But as he looked at the terrified little girl, all those rules seemed meaningless. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about a child who needed help, and she had somehow recognized that despite his rigid exterior, there was someone inside the uniform who might care enough to act. The girl glanced over her shoulder nervously, then back at Thomas. She mouthed the word please and pointed to herself, then made a gesture with her hands as if she were trapped or confined. Thomas noticed fresh bruises on her small wrists and what appeared to be rope marks. His stomach churned with the realization that this child was likely in serious danger. Making a decision that would change both their lives forever, Thomas did something he had never done while on duty. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to the girl, acknowledging that he had received her message. It was a tiny movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but the relief that flooded the girl's face told him she had seen it. The girl quickly stepped back into the crowd. As a group of tourists approached for photos, Thomas maintained his rigid posture, but his eyes tracked her movement. She positioned herself behind a large family from Germany who were taking turns posing next to the guards. From this partially hidden position, she began making more subtle gestures. She pointed down the street toward a white van parked about 200 meters away. Thomas followed her gaze and noticed two men sitting in the front seats, both wearing dark clothing and sunglasses. They appeared to be watching the area around the palace gates. The girl then pointed to herself and held up her fingers to show the number 3, then pointed back toward the van. Thomas understood immediately. There were 3 people being held, and they were connected to the men in the white van. His heart pounded as he realized he was witnessing something far more serious than a lost child. This appeared to be a case of abduction, possibly human trafficking, happening right in front of one of the most secure locations in London. The weight of the situation hit him like a physical blow. Here was a child who had somehow managed to escape or been given a brief moment of freedom, and she had used that precious time to seek help from someone she hoped might have the authority and ability to save her and others. The trust she was placing in him was both humbling and terrifying. Thomas knew he had to act, but he also knew that any wrong move could endanger the girl and potentially others. If the men in the van realized their captive had made contact with authorities, they might flee immediately or worse, harm their victims. He needed to signal for help without alerting the suspects or causing a scene that might panic the crowd of innocent tourists. The girl made one more gesture, pointing to a building across the street with several floors of apartments above street-level shops. She held up 2 fingers and pointed upward, then made a sleeping gesture with her hands against her cheek. Thomas interpreted this as meaning 2 people were being held on the 2nd floor of that building. As if sensing his understanding, the girl pressed the SOS note against the gate one more time, then slowly backed away into the crowd. She gave him one last pleading look before disappearing among the tourists. Thomas felt a surge of panic as she vanished from sight, but he forced himself to focus on what he needed to do next. Breaking every rule in the guard manual, Thomas made a subtle hand signal behind his back, hoping his fellow guards stationed at the adjacent post would notice. It was a signal they had developed informally during training, a way to communicate urgent situations without breaking their stoic facade. When his colleague responded with a slight adjustment of his rifle position, Thomas knew his message had been received. Within minutes, Thomas heard the subtle sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Sergeant Major Williams, his commanding officer, appeared at his shoulder with the practiced casualness of someone conducting a routine inspection. To any observer, this would look like a normal supervisory visit, but Thomas knew Williams had received the emergency signal. "Report, Mitchell," Williams said quietly, his voice barely audible above the chatter of tourists. Still maintaining his forward gaze, Thomas spoke in a barely audible whisper. "Child approached with SOS message, sir. Possible abduction situation. White van, 2 suspects, additional victims indicated in building across the street." He discreetly tilted his eyes toward the locations the girl had identified. Williams followed, Thomas's gaze, and immediately spotted both the van and the building. His expression didn't change, but Thomas could sense the tension in his commanding officer's posture. Williams had 20 years of military experience, including tours in active combat zones. He knew how to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately. "Did the child provide any other information?" Williams asked, pretending to adjust something on Thomas's uniform. 3 total victims, sir, 2 being held on the 2nd floor of the building, suspects monitoring from the vehicle. Child showed signs of physical restraint, fresh bruising on wrists. Thomas's training kicked in as he provided a concise tactical assessment, Williams nodded almost imperceptibly. Maintain your position. Do not acknowledge if the child returns. I'm calling this in to Metropolitan Police immediately. He paused, for a moment, then added, Good work, Mitchell. You may have just saved lives. As Williams walked away, Thomas felt the full weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. Somewhere nearby, possibly within sight of where he stood, people were being held against their will. The little girl who had shown incredible courage in seeking help was now back in danger, and he could do nothing but stand perfectly still and wait. The next 30 minutes felt like the longest of Thomas's life. He watched the white van carefully, noting when the occupants moved or seemed to be communicating with someone. The vehicle remained in position, but he noticed one of the men occasionally speaking into what appeared to be a radio or phone. Tourists continued to flow around him, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. Children laughed and posed for pictures, while their parents bought souvenirs from nearby vendors. The normal rhythm of London life continued unchanged, but Thomas felt like he was existing in a completely different reality, where every second counted and lives hung in the balance. Then, he saw her again. The little girl emerged from a narrow alley between two shops, moving more cautiously than before. She stayed much farther back this time, positioning herself behind a tour group that was listening to a guide explain the history of the palace. But even from a distance, Thomas could see that something had changed. She looked more frightened than before, and she kept glancing back toward the building where she had indicated the other victims were being held. The girl caught Thomas's eye and made a subtle gesture with her hand, drawing a line across her throat. The meaning was clear and chilling. Time was running out. Whether the captors had discovered her brief absence or were preparing to move their victims to another location, something had happened to escalate the urgency of the situation. Thomas wanted desperately to signal back to her, to somehow communicate that help was coming, but he knew that any visible response could endanger her further. Instead, he focused on memorizing every detail of her appearance and location, hoping that when the police arrived, he would be able to guide them to her quickly. In the distance, Thomas began to notice subtle signs that law enforcement was responding. A police officer in civilian clothing appeared at a nearby street corner, pretending to read a newspaper while clearly observing the area. Another plainclothes officer set up position near a bus stop with a clear view of the white van. The response was professional and discreet, but Thomas could see the tactical positioning taking shape. The girl seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere as well. She looked around nervously, perhaps noticing the same subtle signs that Thomas had spotted. Her eyes met his one more time, and in that brief moment Thomas saw something that nearly broke his heart. Gratitude mixed with terror, hope combined with the terrible knowledge that she might not live to see rescue arrive. The coordinated police response began to unfold with military precision. Thomas watched as additional undercover officers took positions at key points around the area, each one blending seamlessly into the tourist environment. A woman with a baby stroller positioned herself near the entrance to the building the girl had identified. A man pretending to window shop took up a position with a clear view of both the van and the building entrance. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed dramatically. One of the men in the white van stepped out and began walking quickly toward the building across the street. He moved with purpose and urgency, constantly checking his surroundings. Thomas realized with growing dread that something had gone wrong. Either the captors had discovered the girl's attempt to get help, or they were preparing to move their victims to avoid detection. The little girl, who had been maintaining her position behind the tour group, suddenly looked terrified. She began backing away from the area, her eyes wide with panic. Thomas could see her looking frantically between the building where she had indicated the other victims were being held, and the various escape routes around the square. Then Thomas saw something that made his blood freeze. A third man, one he hadn't noticed before, emerged from the building and began scanning the crowd systematically. His gaze moved methodically from person to person, clearly searching for someone specific. When his eyes locked onto the little girl, Thomas knew immediately that she had been discovered. The man began moving toward the girl with deliberate intent, not running but walking fast enough to close the distance quickly without attracting attention from casual observers. The girl saw him coming and started to move away, but she was small, and the crowd was thick. Thomas watched in horror as the gap between them closed steadily. Breaking every protocol he had ever learned, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He stepped forward from his post, abandoning his position at the gate for the first time in 6 years of service. The movement was subtle but decisive, and it immediately caught the attention of his fellow guard and several nearby tourists. Armed. Police, stop where you are. The shouted command came from multiple directions as the undercover officers revealed themselves simultaneously. The careful coordination Thomas had observed was now in full action as armed police emerged from their concealed positions throughout the area. The man pursuing the girl froze for a moment, realizing he had walked into a trap. The second man, still near the white van, immediately began running in the opposite direction. Chaos erupted as tourists suddenly found themselves in the middle of a police operation, with officers shouting commands and moving with weapons drawn. Thomas ignored the confusion around him and focused entirely on the little girl. She was trapped between the crowd of panicking tourists and the man who had been chasing her. Without hesitation, Thomas pushed through the crowd toward her, his bright red uniform making him clearly visible above the mass of people. The girl saw him coming and ran directly toward him, trusting the guard who had acknowledged her desperate plea for help. Thomas reached her just as the man who had been pursuing her was tackled to the ground by 2 police officers. He swept the child up in his arms, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath the dirty clothes. "You're safe now," he whispered. To her, the first words he had spoken to a civilian while on duty in his entire career. "You were so brave. You saved everyone." The girl wrapped her thin arms around Thomas's neck and buried her face against his shoulder. He could feel her trembling, but also the relief in her small body as she finally allowed herself to trust that rescue had arrived. Around them, the police operation continued with swift efficiency. The 2 men from the van were in custody, and Thomas could see officers entering the building where the girl had indicated other victims were being held. Radio chatter filled the air as additional units coordinated to ensure no suspects escaped and no victims remained in danger. Sergeant Major Williams appeared at Thomas's side, his face showing a mixture of pride and concern. "Mitchell, you just broke about 15 different protocols," he said quietly. Thomas looked down at the little girl in his arms, then back at his commanding officer. "Yes, sir, I did." Williams studied Thomas's face for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes, soldier, there are things more important than protocol. Let's get this little hero to the paramedics and see what else she can tell us about what happened here." The paramedics worked gently with the little girl, whose name they learned was Emma. She was dehydrated and showed signs of having been held captive for several days, but physically she was going to be okay. More importantly, her information had led police to rescue 2 other children who had been held in the building across the street. Just as she had indicated, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen took charge of the scene and spoke with Thomas while Emma was being examined by medical professionals. "Sergeant Mitchell, the child's information was remarkably accurate. We found 2 other victims exactly where she indicated, both children who had been reported missing from different parts of London over the past week." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Are they all right, ma'am?" "They will be, thanks to your actions and this little girl's incredible courage," Detective Chen replied. "We've also discovered that this was part of a larger trafficking operation. The suspects we arrested are already providing information that's leading to additional arrests across the city." As the initial chaos of the arrest settled, Thomas found himself at the center of attention from his superior officers, the police, and inevitably the media. Word had spread quickly about the Royal Guard who had broken protocol to help rescue kidnapped children, and news cameras were already arriving at the scene. Colonel Henderson, the commanding officer of Thomas's regiment, arrived within an hour. Thomas expected to face serious disciplinary action for abandoning his post and breaking numerous regulations. Instead, he found himself in the colonel's temporary field office, receiving what amounted to a debriefing rather than a reprimand. Mitchell, in 30 years of military service, I've learned that there are times when following orders is the most important thing a soldier can do, and there are times when understanding the spirit behind those orders matters more than the letter of the law, Colonel Henderson said. Today you understood that your primary duty is to protect people, not just to stand at attention. Thomas felt the weight of the day's events settling on his shoulders. Sir, I couldn't just stand there and watch a child in danger. Everything we do in this uniform is supposed to be about service and protection. That's exactly right, Sergeant, and that's why, instead of disciplinary action, I'm recommending you for commendation. Your quick thinking and willingness to act saved 3 children's lives. Emma, now cleaned up and with proper medical attention, asked to see Thomas before. She was taken to be reunited with her family. When he approached her, she was sitting wrapped in a blanket, looking much more like the 7-year-old child she was instead of the desperate survivor he had first encountered. "Are you really a guard for the Queen?" she asked, with the directness that only children possess. "I am," Thomas replied, kneeling down to her eye level. "And you know what? I think you would make an excellent guard yourself someday. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Emma smiled for the first time since he had seen her. "I knew you would help. My mom always told me that soldiers are the good guys and that they help people who need it." Her expression grew serious again. There were other kids there before Jake and Mia. The bad men said they were taking them somewhere else. Will the police find them too? Detective Chen, who had been listening to the conversation, knelt down beside Thomas. "Emma, because you were so smart and so brave today, we now know about the bad men, and we can look for any other children they might have taken. You've helped us save people you haven't even met yet." The impact of Emma's actions was already rippling outward. The information provided by the arrested suspects was leading to coordinated raids across London and beyond. International law enforcement agencies were being contacted as the scope of the trafficking network became clear. What had started as one little girl's desperate plea for help was becoming a major breakthrough in combating organized crime. As evening approached and the area around Buckingham Palace returned to normal, Thomas realized that his life had fundamentally changed. The story was already making international news. Royal Guard breaks protocol to save kidnapped children. But more than the media attention, he knew that he would never again be able to stand at his post without thinking about the responsibility that came with the uniform and the trust that people placed in those who wore it. 3 months later, Thomas stood in the same position at Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. The investigation that began with Emma's SOS note had led to the rescue of 17 children and the arrest of 32 people involved in an international trafficking network. The case had made headlines around the world and led to policy changes in how security personnel were trained to recognize and respond to potential trafficking situations. Emma's family had invited Thomas to visit them several times since the rescue. Her parents, David and Margaret Collins, had been searching frantically for their daughter for 5 days before she managed to escape and seek help at the palace. They credited Thomas not just with saving Emma, but with restoring their faith that good people still existed in the world. The official commendation ceremony had been held at the palace itself, with senior military officials and members of the royal household in attendance. Thomas received the Military Cross for exceptional courage and devotion to duty. But the moment he treasured most was when Emma herself had been invited to present him with a special thank you card she had made, decorated with drawings of guards and princesses and the words "My hero," written in careful 7-year-old handwriting. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Thomas had appeared on news programs across Britain and internationally, telling the story of how one child's courage had led to such significant results. He always made sure to emphasize that Emma was the real hero of the story, and that his role had simply been to recognize her need for help and act on it. The experience had also led to changes in training protocols for the Queen's Guard and other ceremonial military units. Guards now received specific instruction on recognizing signs of distress from members of the public, particularly children, and clear guidelines on when and how to break protocol in emergency situations. Thomas had been involved in developing these new training procedures, sharing his experience with new recruits. Detective Chen had kept Thomas updated on the ongoing investigation. The trafficking network had been operating for years, moving children between cities and even countries. Emma's information had provided the breakthrough that investigators had been seeking for months. The 3 men arrested that day had led police to safe houses, document forgers, and corrupt officials who had been facilitating the operation. On this particular morning, as Thomas took his position at the palace gates, he noticed a familiar family approaching among the tourists. Emma, now healthy and confident, was walking between her parents, pointing excitedly at the guards and explaining to her younger cousin how she had once needed help from one of them. When Emma spotted Thomas, her face lit up with recognition. She waved enthusiastically, and for a moment, Thomas almost smiled back before remembering his duties. Instead, he gave her the smallest possible nod, the same gesture he had used to acknowledge her SOS message months earlier. Emma understood immediately and grinned widely. She pulled out a new drawing from her backpack and held it up for him to see. This one showed a guard in a red uniform standing next to a little girl with the words, "Thank you for listening," written across the top. As the Collins family moved on with their tour, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day when a desperate child had trusted him enough to ask for help. He had learned that sometimes the most important part of being a guard wasn't standing perfectly still or following every protocol exactly. Sometimes it was recognizing when another human being needed help and having the courage to provide it. This job was still the same in many ways. Tourists still posed for pictures. Children still tried to make the guards laugh, and the daily routine of ceremonial duties continued unchanged. But Thomas now approached each day with a deeper understanding of what service really meant. He knew that behind the pageantry and tradition, his role was fundamentally about protecting people and being worthy of the trust they placed in him. Emma's courage in seeking help that day had saved not only her own life and the lives of the other children held captive, but had also reminded everyone involved that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from the most unexpected sources. A 7-year-old girl with a crayon-written SOS note had changed the course of multiple investigations, saved numerous lives, and demonstrated that courage has no age limit. As his shift continued, Thomas maintained his traditional stoic posture, but inside he carried the knowledge that he had been part of something extraordinary. He had been trusted with a desperate plea for help, and he had proven worthy of that trust. In a world where cynicism often prevailed, Emma's story served as a powerful reminder that good people still existed, that help could come from unexpected places, and that sometimes breaking the rules was the most honorable thing a person could do.